The applause echoed through the grand hall of St. Paul's Church as the bishop placed the golden plaque on the podium, declaring Reverend Elias Whitaker a living saint for his decades of selfless service to the community. Maxwell sat in the third row, his hand tightly clasped with Nathaniel's under the cover of the pew, his heart pounding not with pride but with a dread that threatened to consume him whole as the horrifying truth he alone knew burned in his mind. The entire town of Riverton, Illinois, had turned out for the event banners, praising the Reverend hung from every rafter. The choir sang hymns of gratitude while cameras from the local news station captured every smile. Maxwell forced a neutral expression on his face as people around him clapped and cheered, but inside he felt the weight of the secret he had uncovered just weeks earlier in his adoptive father's private study. Nathaniel squeezed his hand gently, a silent reminder that he was not alone in this moment of public celebration that masked private torment. At 31, Maxwell had built a life far from Riverton in Chicago, where he worked as a freelance writer focusing on stories of resilience, and where he had found love with Nathaniel, a 30-year-old social worker who helped young people navigate their identities with compassion and without judgment. They had driven the 4 hours south for the ceremony at the Reverend's personal invitation because refusing would have raised questions Maxwell was not ready to answer yet. As the bishop continued his speech praising the Reverend's work with at-risk youth and his founding of the Path to Light ministry, Maxwell could not stop the flood of memories. He remembered being 7 years old when his biological parents died in a house fire, the kind Reverend stepping in as guardian and later adopter, calling it divine intervention. The early years had been filled with warmth, Bible stories at bedtime, and community picnics where everyone treated Maxwell like a miracle child. But everything changed when he turned 15 and confessed to the Reverend that he felt different, that he liked boys. The man who had once called him son had locked him in his room for days, quoting scripture and arranging secret prayer sessions that left Maxwell feeling broken and ashamed. He had been sent to a week-long camp run by the ministry, where counselors insisted his feelings were a test from God to be overcome through faith and discipline. Maxwell had run away from that camp at 16, hitchhiking back to Riverton, only to face more lectures and isolation until he finally left for good at 18 with nothing but a backpack and a scholarship to a college in Chicago. There he met Nathaniel in a campus support group for LGBTQ students, and over time their friendship grew into a deep, loving partnership built on mutual respect and shared dreams of a future free from the shadows of past. Now back in Riverton for the first time in years, Maxwell watched the Reverend, 70 years old and frail, but still commanding the stage with that same charismatic smile that had fooled so many. The ceremony wrapped up with a standing ovation, and the Reverend invited Maxwell and Nathaniel to stay at the old family house for the week to celebrate properly. Maxwell nodded politely, but as they walked out into the bright afternoon sun, he whispered to Nathaniel, "I don't know how long I can keep pretending." Nathaniel replied softly, "We will face whatever comes together, just like always." They drove the short distance to the large white house on the edge of town, the one Maxwell had grown up in, with its wraparound porch and manicured lawn that still looked exactly the same. The Reverend had insisted on hosting them, despite the tension Maxwell felt every time their eyes met. That evening, as they unpacked in the guest room that used to be Maxwell's childhood bedroom, Nathaniel pulled him into a gentle hug. "You have come so far, Max. Don't let this pull you back." Maxwell nodded, but his mind raced with a memory of the locked drawer he had noticed in the study earlier, the one he planned to open when the house was quiet. The next morning, after breakfast with the Reverend and a few church elders who stopped by to congratulate them, Maxwell found a moment alone. The drawer was not locked after all, and inside he found old journals, yellowed letters, and a stack of financial records that made his blood run cold. The first entry in the Reverend's handwriting, dated 30 years back, detailed a secret meeting with a young assistant pastor named Daniel, a man Maxwell vaguely remembered as kind and full of life. The pages described feelings the Reverend called sinful but could not deny, and how he had ended the relationship by pressuring Daniel into the Path to Light program himself. Further entries reveal donations from the church funneled into a private account used for personal trips and luxuries, all while the Reverend preached poverty and sacrifice to the congregation. Maxwell sat on the floor of the study, his hand shaking as he read how the Reverend had covered up Daniel's suicide 10 years ago, blaming it on unrelated depression while using the tragedy to raise more funds for the ministry. This was the man the town now called a saint, the father figure who had shaped Maxwell's life with control and hypocrisy. He heard footsteps and quickly hid the journals as Nathaniel entered the room. "What did you find, Max?" asked Nathaniel, seeing the look on his face. Maxwell pulled him close and whispered the beginning of the truth. "I think everything we knew about him is a lie." The day continued with a community lunch where elders praised the Reverend's legacy and Maxwell smiled through gritted teeth, feeling the internal storm build. Nathaniel stayed by his side, offering quiet strength, but Maxwell could sense the growing pressure on their relationship as the secret began to weigh on both of them. By evening, Maxwell had read enough to know he could not stay silent forever, but the question of when and how to reveal it haunted him as he lay awake beside Nathaniel, listening to the familiar creaks of the old house. The horrifying truth was not just about money or hidden feelings. It was about the lives ruined, including his own, in the name of a false holiness. As the first file of their stay ended, Maxwell knew the coming days would test everything he had built with Nathaniel and force him to decide if the truth was worth destroying the only family and community he had ever known. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows of the old house, casting long shadows across the wooden table where Maxwell and Nathaniel sat with the Reverend over coffee and fresh muffins from the church ladies. Maxwell tried to focus on the casual conversation about the ceremony, but every word from the Reverend felt like a knife twisting deeper into the wound opened by those journals. Nathaniel noticed the tension and steered the talk toward neutral topics like the beautiful weather and the upcoming town fair, but Maxwell could barely manage more than nods. After breakfast, the Reverend excused himself for a meeting with the bishop, leaving the two men alone in the house. Maxwell led Nathaniel back to the study and showed him the journals page by page, explaining in a hushed voice how the man everyone revered had lived a double life, suppressing his own identity while punishing others for the same struggles. Nathaniel read in silence, his face growing more serious with each entry. "This is bigger than we thought, Max," he said, finally closing the book. "We need to be careful who we tell." They spent the afternoon walking the familiar streets of Riverton hand in hand when no one was looking, stopping at the small park where Maxwell had played as a child. Under the bright sun, they sat on a bench, and Maxwell opened up about the emotional abuse he had endured, the nights of forced prayers, and the camp that had left scars on his confidence for years. Nathaniel listened without interruption, then shared his own story of coming out to a conservative family in a nearby town and the years of strained holidays that followed. Their bond felt stronger in that moment, a shared understanding of what it meant to rebuild after rejection. Yet the discovery weighed on them both, creating small misunderstandings as Maxwell grew distant, lost in thought about the financial records showing how church funds had paid for the Reverend's private cabin retreats while families in the congregation struggled. Nathaniel suggested they leave Riverton early, but Maxwell insisted on staying to gather more evidence, determined to understand the full scope of the betrayal. That evening at a church potluck, the elders pulled Maxwell aside, praising how the Reverend had saved him from a tragic past, and Maxwell felt the hypocrisy choke him. One elder mentioned Daniel's name in passing as a sad loss to the ministry, and Maxwell nearly confronted him, but Nathaniel gently pulled him away. Back at the house, tensions rose when Maxwell accused Nathaniel of not understanding the depth of the pain. Nathaniel responded calmly, "I understand more than you know, but rushing this could hurt innocent people who still believe in the good he did." They reconciled with a quiet conversation on the porch under the stars, Nathaniel reminding Maxwell that his identity was not defined by the Reverend's lies. The next day, Maxwell continued digging, finding letters from other men who had been quietly pushed out of the church for questioning the path to light methods. One letter described a young man who had taken his own life after the program, leaving a note blaming the pressure. Maxwell realized this pattern had affected dozens, and his own experience was just one thread in a larger web of control. Nathaniel supported him by helping organize the documents, but warned about the emotional toll. Their relationship faced its first real test when Maxwell snapped at Nathaniel for suggesting they consult a lawyer first. Later, they made up with a long talk about trust and the importance of facing the past together. By the end of the second day, Maxwell had a clearer picture of the horrifying truth. The Reverend had built an empire on fear and deception while preaching love, and Maxwell knew the confrontation was coming soon. The town continued to celebrate the saint in their midst, unaware of the storm brewing in the house on the hill. Maxwell woke early the third day, determined to confront at least part of the truth. He found the Reverend in the garden, tending roses, a peaceful scene that contrasted sharply with the darkness in the journals. Nathaniel joined them for breakfast, and the conversation turned to the ministry's impact. Maxwell carefully mentioned Daniel's name, watching the Reverend's face tighten for a split second before he dismissed it as ancient history. Later, Maxwell showed Nathaniel more evidence, including bank statements proving the embezzlement. They decided to visit the local library to research public records, confirming the pattern of donations and expenditures. On the way, they stopped at the home of an elderly woman who had lost her son to the program years ago. She spoke with tears about the pressure and isolation her son had felt, and how the Reverend had visited only to offer prayers, not real help. Maxwell felt his resolve strengthen, but also the pain of knowing he could have been that son. Back at the house, they faced their first direct conflict when the Reverend's sister, Aunt Margaret, arrived unannounced and found them in the study with the documents. She accused Maxwell of betraying the family that had taken him and demanding to know why he was digging into the past. Nathaniel stepped in defending Maxwell, but Margaret turned on him too, calling their relationship unnatural and a test of faith. The argument escalated with raised voices and old wounds reopening as Margaret revealed she had known about some of the financial irregularities, but believed they were for the greater good. Maxwell felt betrayed by the family member who had once been kind to him, and Nathaniel bore the brunt of the prejudice with grace but visible hurt. That night after Margaret left Maxwell, and Nathaniel sat on the back porch processing the day. Nathaniel admitted the confrontation had stirred his own fears of rejection from Maxwell's world, but he reaffirmed his commitment. Maxwell apologized for his sharpness, realizing how the discoveries were straining their partnership. They held each other under the full moonlight, finding comfort in the connection that had carried them through so much already. The next morning, Maxwell received a call from an old high school friend who had heard rumors of his questions and offered support, but also warned that exposing the truth could divide the town. Misunderstandings grew when the friend misinterpreted Maxwell's hesitation as doubt about his own identity, leading to a tense coffee meeting where Maxwell had to reaffirm who he was. Nathaniel waited outside the cafe, offering a supportive smile when it ended. By afternoon, they had compiled enough evidence to see the full horrifying picture. The Reverend had not only hidden his struggles, but actively harmed others to protect his image. Maxwell knew a decision loomed, but the fear of losing the only home he had known kept him silent for now. The day ended with a quiet dinner, where the Reverend praised their relationship in vague terms, unaware of the gathering storm. The fourth day brought a much-needed break as Maxwell and Nathaniel escaped the house for a long walk in the countryside park on the edge of Riverton. The sun shone brightly on the fields, and they found a quiet spot by the river where they could talk openly without fear of being overheard. Maxwell shared more about his journey to self-acceptance, how meeting Nathaniel had been the turning point that allowed him to embrace his identity without shame. Nathaniel reciprocated with stories of his work, helping teens avoid the kind of conversion pressure Maxwell had endured. Their conversation turned romantic as they recalled their first date in Chicago and the simple joys that had built their life together. In that moment of connection under the open sky, they reaffirmed their love, and Maxwell felt a spark of hope that the truth could lead to healing rather than destruction. But the difficulties returned when they returned to town and ran into church elders at the local diner. The conversation quickly turned to the honoring events, and one elder asked pointed questions about Maxwell's life in the city, implying disapproval of his choices. Nathaniel stood firm beside him, calmly stating their happiness and contributions to society, but the prejudice was palpable, leaving both men drained. Back at the house, Maxwell retreated to the study again, finding more letters that detailed the Reverend's secret meetings and the way he had manipulated young men into silence. The emotional toll showed as Maxwell broke down in tears for the first time in years, Nathaniel holding him through the pain. That evening, they faced another misunderstanding when the Reverend invited them to a private prayer session for family unity. Maxwell declined politely, but the Reverend pressed, and Nathaniel intervened, explaining their boundaries. The exchange highlighted the cultural clash and left Maxwell questioning if staying was worth the constant battles. Later, they talked late into the night about the sacrifices they might need to make, Maxwell considering whether revealing the truth was an act of justice or revenge. Nathaniel encouraged him to think about the young people still in the ministry who could be protected. Their bond deepened through the conflict, proving stronger than the external pressures. The following morning brought a call from a reporter friend in Chicago, interested in the story, but Maxwell hesitated, not ready to go public. Nathaniel supported whatever pace he needed, but gently reminded him of the power of truth. As the day progressed, Maxwell began drafting a letter to the bishop outlining the findings without naming himself, yet testing the waters. The difficulties mounted with anonymous notes left at the house door, questioning their presence in town, but they faced them together. By the end of the fourth day, Maxwell had a clearer sense of his identity, not as the broken boy the Reverend had tried to fix, but as a strong man capable of change. The romantic and emotional support from Nathaniel was the anchor that kept him grounded amid the rising tensions. On the fifth day, Maxwell and Nathaniel drove to a neighboring town to meet the family of one of the men affected by the program. The meeting in a modest living room was emotional, as the parents shared letters from their son describing the shame and isolation he felt after sessions with the Reverend. Maxwell recognized the language from his own experience, and the connection solidified his determination. Nathaniel took notes offering resources for healing, and the family expressed gratitude for someone finally listening. On the drive back, they discussed the broader impact, realizing the horrifying truth extended beyond personal betrayal to a system that had hurt countless lives. Back in Riverton, a betrayal came from an unexpected source: Maxwell's old friend from high school, who had seemed supportive but had leaked their questions to the church elders. The confrontation happened in the town hall during a planning meeting for the final ceremony, where an elder pulled Maxwell aside, accusing him of spreading lies. Nathaniel stood by him, defending the need for accountability, but the room filled with whispers and judgmental glances. Maxwell felt the sting of the betrayal, deeply questioning who he could trust. That evening at the house, the argument with Nathaniel surfaced again as Maxwell wondered if exposing everything would destroy the good the ministry still did for some families. Nathaniel argued passionately that silence would allow the harm to continue, and that real change required honesty. The discussion lasted hours, with both men airing fears about their future and the cost of their relationship. Eventually, they reached an understanding that the decision was Maxwell's, but the support was unconditional. The next morning, Maxwell visited the Reverend in his study and hinted at the discoveries, watching the older man deflect with scripture and claims of forgiveness. The interaction left Maxwell more resolved than ever. Later, they researched legal options with a discreet call to a lawyer in Chicago, who advised gathering more proof before any public step. The day brought more small conflicts as townspeople avoided them at the grocery store, and a former teacher made a veiled comment about loyalty. Through it all, Nathaniel remained the steady presence, helping Maxwell process the psychological weight. By nightfall, Maxwell had organized the evidence into a clear timeline and felt the weight of the upcoming ceremony like a storm on the horizon. The growth in Maxwell was evident as he began to see himself not as a victim, but as a voice for those who could not speak. The sixth day started with a heavy conversation over breakfast, where Maxwell laid out his plan to speak at the ceremony. Nathaniel listened carefully, then shared his concerns about the potential backlash, not just for them, but for the entire community that relied on the church for support. The discussion turned into their deepest argument, yet with Maxwell accusing Nathaniel of holding him back and Nathaniel responding that true love meant considering all consequences. They parted ways for a few hours, Maxwell walking alone through the fields to clear his head, while Nathaniel stayed at the house organizing notes. When they reunited on the porch, the reconciliation was tender as each apologized for the harsh words and reaffirmed their commitment to facing the future as a team. Maxwell realized the sacrifice he might have to make, giving up any chance of reconciliation with the Reverend but gaining peace with himself. That afternoon, they attended a community event where the Reverend was again celebrated, and Maxwell used the opportunity to observe the genuine good the man had done for some people, the food drives and youth scholarships that coexisted with the harm. The internal conflict raged, but Nathaniel reminded him that nuance did not erase the need for accountability. In the evening, a surprise visit from a young man who had been through the program recently and was struggling brought the issue home. Maxwell and Nathaniel listened and offered guidance without revealing too much, but the encounter strengthened Maxwell's resolve. Later, they talked about their own relationship, the way it had grown through adversity, and the future they envisioned beyond Riverton. The day ended with a quiet moment of intimacy, not physical, but emotional, as they held hands and planned their next steps after the ceremony. Maxwell began writing his speech, carefully balancing truth with compassion, knowing the words could change everything. The difficulties had tested them, but also forged a stronger partnership ready for whatever came next. The seventh day was the eve of the big ceremony, and tension filled the house as Maxwell prepared his remarks. The Reverend sensed something was off and pulled him aside for a private talk filled with reminders of gratitude and warnings about division. Maxwell held his tongue, but the encounter fueled his courage. Nathaniel helped rehearse the speech, offering feedback on tone to keep it focused on healing rather than attack. That afternoon, the town buzzed with preparations, and Maxwell faced more confrontations from elders who had heard rumors. Nathaniel stood firmly by his side, turning each encounter into a chance to model respect amid disagreement. As evening fell, they shared a quiet dinner, and Maxwell expressed his fears about the unknown aftermath. Nathaniel reassured him with stories of other people who had found strength in truth-telling. The night was restless, but they found comfort in each other. On the morning of the ceremony, the sun shone brightly as the church filled with hundreds. Maxwell sat with Nathaniel in the front row, listening to the opening praises. When his turn came to speak, he stood at the podium, his voice steady as he shared parts of his story, and the need for transparency and leadership. The congregation shifted uncomfortably as he mentioned the importance of accountability without full details yet. The Reverend looked shocked, and the room erupted in murmurs. Nathaniel stood beside him offering silent support as the climax built. Maxwell revealed enough to plant seeds of doubt without immediate destruction, choosing a path of awakening over total destruction. The reactions were mixed, some angry, some thoughtful, and the Reverend attempted to respond with platitudes. The moment was intense with emotions running high, but Maxwell felt a sense of liberation as he stepped down. The ceremony continued awkwardly, but the seed was planted and Maxwell knew the conversation had only begun. In the days following the ceremony, the town of Riverton buzzed with whispered debates and private meetings. Maxwell and Nathaniel stayed a few more days to face the consequences, meeting with those who wanted to hear more and supporting those affected. The Reverend retreated into silence, but a few elders reached out for private conversations, showing the first cracks in the facade. Maxwell felt a mix of relief and sorrow as some relationships fractured while new ones formed around honesty. Nathaniel remained his rock, helping navigate the media inquiries that followed and planning their return to Chicago. On the last evening, they packed the car and shared a final walk in the park where their journey had deepened. Maxwell reflected on his growth from the scared adopted son to a man who could stand in his truth. Nathaniel expressed pride in the courage shown, and they talked about starting a support network back home for those escaping similar situations. As they drove away from Riverton, the sun set behind them, casting a warm glow on the road ahead. The experience had tested their love and strengthened it, proving that facing the past together built a future worth fighting for. Maxwell had chosen not total destruction, but a call for reflection, and the community would decide its own path. The horrifying truth had been shared, and with it came the possibility of real change. True or false, exposing a revered figure's hidden hypocrisy always destroys more lives than it saves.